at Tongji University, Shanghai, Ain Shams University, Cairo. And I think one thing he has forgotten to say, he's also been in Mauritius, in the Tagore Institute, and Sri Lanka. So, as I said, that his list is long, and I think he's doing a tremendous job being director of Granth Vibhag, where publications continue, and what we need is literature. So, thank you, Amrit, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to your paper, as we all are. The title of the paper is "Let the Boundaries of This Village Become Our Whole World." Beautiful title. Women and Plague in Year of Wonders. So look forward to that, Amrit.
Is my screen visible, Bashabidi?
Your screen is visible. I was just wondering, maybe I should stop my screen. And how do I do this? Do I do stop cam? Because that will take me off, won't it? Yes, now I can see. Yeah, right. It's shared. Thank you.
Right. All right. Thank you, Bashabidi. Let me just remind my friends who are on the show that many of the most fruitful years of my research, at least two of them, were with Bashabidi, with whom we did the Ukeri project. Of course, I am looking forward that Neil is, of course, listening to this. And I still remember Bashabidi's lovely house with the daffodils. I hope they are in bloom despite the pandemic. And let me just state the title of my presentation. It's titled "Let the Boundaries of This Village Become Our Whole World: Women and the Plague in the Year of Wonders 2001. Now, this, of course, takes off from Geraldine Brooks's novel, The Year of Wonders, which is about a tiny village of Eyam, which is in the Peak District of England, which faced with a rather virulent attack of the plague. In fact, approximately 260 of its people died out of a total population of a maximum of 600. So you can see almost half the population died, yet who, in a great act of courage and empathy, quarantined themselves with the boundary stone, allowing nobody to come in, and more importantly, allowing no plague patient to go out of the village. It's been a one-off, really, and over and above as the COVID-19 has spread, the case of Eyam has been an inspiration for a lot of people when we talk about social distancing, quarantining, empathy for the people, the thought of the collective. Here was an example where the collective actually rose to protect a greater collective. And I take this novel, obviously you understand that the plague took place in 1666, 66 rather, but Geraldine Brooks is writing this in 2001, so obviously it's a creation through memory and literature. And my paper would like to just examine the ways in which, the body of the woman in the past and in the present becomes a site through which understanding of disease, pandemics, and the liminal zones that these events offer us can be understood. So in a way, literature and history becomes my gateway. And as Bashabidi pointed out, from the past, salvation comes. I would like to say from the past, we once again learn, and we see how, fictional representations try and look at and probe into the unsung histories of the past. You see, and why do I mention this word unsung or unrepresented? Because the question of women during the plague has been largely something which has been extremely underrepresented in the broader canon of literature. It's rather, the plague has been, and the pandemic, of course, has been something which has been represented solely through the prism of men. So how did women, or how were women impacted? And what could possibly be the ways in which women could be represented? These are the questions, some of the questions that I'm going to bring, taking this novel as a gateway. So these are my research questions, so that I do not, step over the boundaries and keep myself within the prescribed time period, like the people of Eam. What was the role of women during the plague? And this is something which requires a little delving into history. Keeping the story of Eam as a gateway, could the plague have created a different role for women? So how did the plague actually impact them in subsequent history? If so, what were the variations of agency that were offered to women? And this is a question which I'm going to ask at the end of my discussion, as to why Geraldine Brooks, I'm sorry for the typo there, choose such a subject and such a narrator for a novel. So what does one glean from this rewriting of history, as it were? Now, my prism, of course, once again, my theoretical prism is the word liminal, and which comes from the Latin word limen, which means a threshold. The liminal space is therefore a crossing over space. Now, liminality is an idea which we've used a lot in post-colonial criticism, especially thanks to Bhabha. But liminality is properly a term which belongs to ethnography and was used by Van Gennep and later on taken up by the great critic Victor Turner. Right. And both Gennep and Turner talk about the liminal periods where social hierarchies in a time of political and cultural change may be reversed or temporarily dissolved. The continuity of tradition may become uncertain, and future outcomes may be thrown into doubt. You see, pandemic becomes therefore that one moment when we are in a state of flux. So we have a past, but what the present will hold for us and how our behavior will change, undertake a rite of passage, a phrase which we use very commonly, but we need to understand that it goes back to this particular idea of the liminal, creating a fluid, malleable situation that enables new institutions and customs to become established. So what did the plague mean for women, and what new things did it offer for them? So in a way, you see, the plague was a disease that actually sort of created a kind of I would say, a border zone. But once the plague dissolved, the society that emerged created a very different dimension, I am going to argue, for women in general. And this is where I would like to go back to an economic historian who's been very well discussed nowadays, Victoria Bateman, and her book is titled How Women Made the World Rich. Now, Bateman makes this, or gives us this idea that, there was a time when the marriage age of women increased. And this she links to the generation of a different economic setup, a more prosperous, higher economic framework, as it were. And she says that this relocates definitely into the 1500s, and the data before that is very patchy. And one of the popular arguments that Victoria Bateman takes up is that the Black Death, the plague, created a labor scarcity, which enabled opportunities, job opportunities for women, which in turn pushed up the age for marriage in the West. Now, this is a thesis that has received considerable critical attention nowadays, and it is women being able to access into the labor markets which gave them financial independence, and therefore created and generated a whole new impetus and thrust in the Western economy. If you look at it, along with colonialism, this is the great moment when the Western economy makes its leap and establishes itself as the dominant force in the global scenario. So that is Victoria Bateman. The other thing that I'd like to briefly mention before I sort of enter into my major premise is this question of the bill of mortality, the number of deaths that took place every day in London. what did the bill of mortality mean, and why do we keep this COVID tracker at the back of our mind? You see, the bill of mortality, as has been pointed out, meant a systematic combining of this unruly mass of detail of suffering, deaths, into a single printed document, literally making the enormity of the plague tangible. So we need to have figures and a broadsheet, as it were, to, data, hard data, as is now being talked about, to map the plague. Because they were available to all throughout London, the bills gave identifiable shape to an event which was disturbingly amorphous. And you see, this was the great pandemic which was generating havoc in and out of London, as it were, and whose movement was frighteningly indiscernible. So, you didn't have an idea who would suffer the next day. Now, this is Dekker, and Dekker is the first who talks about the role of women during the plague. What specific role, apart from being suffering and dying, what role did the women play? And we see that there are two actual roles that they played: the keepers, people who nursed, looked after the people while they suffered. And as Basubedi pointed out, the mortality rate was almost 50%. So if you had the plague, you were almost always dead. And the others was a very gruesome task of the searcher, right, who would move from door to door, house to house, take a look in and see how many people were actually infected, and therefore keep a death count. You could see that it was a rather macabre kind of a profession. And you see what Dekker writes. I won't read it out to you, but the important phrase there is the views and make a true report to the constable, right, about the precise number of people. Now, I mentioned the mortality bill, the bill of mortality. The bill of mortality would actually be based upon the figures that these women were providing. So women were actually mapping the plague in London. Is something which we hardly know about. Now, the searcher, of course, who were these searchers? You see, these searchers, and this being such a very, very difficult work, you actually could contact the plague and die. So normally women did not come out and volunteer for this. So old women who were dependent on the parishioner for their sustenance were the ones who were pushed into this profession, and therefore were placed in an extremely double bind. The searcher's relationship to the corrupt body and their association with matters of life and death intersected symbolically with early modern culture's deepest anxieties about women, anxieties about familiar figures in witches, prostitutes, and midwives. And, because the searcher interpreted whether this was a plague or not, they were both reviled as well as valued by the society and the fathers of, as it were, the mayor and his cohorts, and reviled by society at large. Yet, throughout the discourses of these searchers, we have the responses that they very often fudged figures, so they were not trusted. You see, one of these ideas that, again, women were not to be trusted in the early modern period, and especially old women had this stigma associated with them. Therefore, you see, recurrently, F.P. Wilson talks about the notoriousness of their dishonesty and incompetence, ignorant and careless searchers, illiterate, without knowledge of disease. Dekker, for example, talks about none thriving but coffin makers, clerks, grave makers, herb women. And therefore, I talked about this double bind, hired to be a reader of science while dangerous, are apparently unambiguous, and these searchers were nevertheless continually under suspicion. Now, this tied in this question of the searcher, the seeker, as it were, with a space which was offered to aged women in early modern England, and we see how You see, women were particularly aware that their words were understood to hold a different relation to truth than men's, and older women were accorded even less credibility while offering testimony. The question also ties in with this idea of uh, very often old women being associated with witchcraft, and especially women who suffered from very many mental diseases were especially susceptible to this branding as the witch. So, in a certain way, the female body, the old female body, the plague ridden body, the body of the witch, and the body of the searcher sort of came together in this one single mass of suspicion. Right. Now, here's a here's an actual case. Since I mentioned very broad points, it would be useful to go back to particular people like Jane Jacques. Jean Jacques, a keeper rather than a searcher, tended to those in her father's house when it was infected with plague. She was hired by the parish. She had to do this duty because she had no other sustenance. And after nursing those sick with the plague, she was shunned and abhorred. She was forced to live in the life of a vagrant and in the wilderness. She eventually gave birth to a bastard child because the women actually of the parish had driven her out of a local barn where she had sought refuge. So you see, the bind in which they were put at tremendous risk and then shunned by the very society that they actually benefited. And there's also this question about the searcher branding herself. We've, in another discussion, talked about the plague doctor with his PPE-like costume, but the searcher also had to carry a red wand and travel across along the streets very close to the gutters, as it were. And this red wand that she carried was a mark of fear. She was feared, as well as she was reviled because the red wand was very close to the white wand, which prostitutes were branded with. So along with opprobrium, you also had this association of the old female body with the body of prostitution as well. You see how women during the plague were actually participating in the civic process, but unlike the men who participated in it, they were being branded in a certain way and then rejected by society. So there's this strong sense of suspicion. There's this strong sense of rejection, as it were. I've talked already about the searchers and the red wand, so I wouldn't want to linger upon this. There are very few representations of the plague because it was considered ominous to represent the plague. This is one broadsheet which I go back to, Dunstall's representation of the plague, and you can there see, if you can see my cursor moving here, this is the woman, this is the searcher, and you can see the keeper here nursing over the plague patient. But this arrival of this searcher would be a great moment of fear, for the people who were infected, and looking at the very searcher on the streets would mean the arrival and the presence of the plague. Now, you see, this question of the keeper as old and incompetent lingered on. I mention this because even 200 years after the plague, Florence Nightingale, whom we ascribe with modern nursing, lamented that nursing had traditionally been left to those who were too old, too weak, too drunken, too dirty, too stupid. Therefore, you see, even Florence Nightingale, in her own way, was articulating this social stigma about the women who participated or who were an integral part of the civic process during the plague. Now, this is a history which I had to bring in because, you see, we hardly talk about this. We talk about the trauma that the plague created. We talk about the pain that it created, but we hardly talk about the role that women played during the plague. And this suspicion of the woman will come into my discussion on on Geraldine Brooks's novel. Now, I've already talked about Eyam, the context. In 1665, the Black Death takes over, and almost half of the population is wiped out, yet the population decide in a very courageous act of the collective that they would not spread the contagion or allow the contagion to spread to any other part of the district. Now, a very quick few pictures to give you a context. This is the Eyam parish church. This is one where the graveyard is, where you have numerous bodies which were interred during the plague. This was the sexton, actually, William Montpesson. In the novel, he's Michael Pompelian. Montpesson was the priest who delivered this sermon to the villagers, talking them into staying and fighting the plague and not allowing it to spread. And because the church could not be a point of assembly, this is the Cucklet Delph, the alternative church, the village amphitheater, which where the people gathered for the service every Sunday so that they could maintain proper social distancing. You see, once again, from the past, salvation comes, or at least understanding comes. This is something which I've taken from the website of the Eyam Museum, and this shows Montpesson sort of delivering his famous sermon to the people who, if you look at it, are maintaining a certain kind of distancing. And this is the book that sort of was inspired by this, Geraldine Brooks, The Year of Wonders, published 2001. Geraldine Brooks being a Pulitzer-winning journalist and based in Australia. Now, I will come to a few other books by Geraldine Brooks at the end of my discussion, but here is her picture, Geraldine Brooks. I will highly recommend her text to a lot of young readers here. I have been extremely sort of influenced by the way in which she's written about the plague, and also in some of the other texts. Now, to give you an idea of the major characters of the novel, so that I can sort of frame my discussion, as it were, about what Brooks, and all of Brooks's novels put forward a woman as a heroine. You see, this is where I would talk about the historical novel as being within that liminal space between fact and fiction, between history and potential history. And this is what fiction does. This is what historical fiction does. It sort of unravels, it sort of probes, it sort of recovers histories which were never written. You see, and very often Brooks's texts talk about these histories and potentialities, narratives of women whose voices were never heard. So who were the major characters? The Bradfords, for example, the gentry, the landed gentry of the place, who incidentally left Eyam when the plague broke out. So they took no part of it. And once they returned, the prestige of the Bradfords were obviously shaken, and they were part of this entire process of the phasing out of the landed gentry that, well, of course, took some time. The second character, of course, is the priest, William Montpesson, here Michael Pompelian, who emerges as heroic with Stanley the sexton. You will have to remember that the older parishioner, the older priest, was Stanley, who belonged to the puritanical sect, who was driven out because the Church of England had sent its own man there. But you see, in the novel, Montpelian sort of makes an alliance with Stanley, and together they convince the villagers that it is in their own interest and in the interest of the others that they quarantine themselves. Eleanor, Montpelian's wife, who seeks to nurse the populace, educate Anna, and I'm going to come to Anna in a moment, and who ultimately succumbs not to the plague but to the madness of one of the women whose husband has been lost to the plague. She sort of kills Eleanor. In reality, of course, William Montpesson, the priest's wife, actually did perish. Yet, in the novel, Eleanor has an aborted pregnancy prior to coming to Eymes, and Montpellier refuses to lie with her so that she may be punished for her lapse. And at the end of the novel, Montpellier is the one who loses all faith. In a moving moment, he actually renounces all faith in God altogether. The other characters, of course, include two women, Mem Godi and Anis Godi, who are the village midwives and brew herbal potions from their garden. Remember, this is the time when antibiotics have not been found, medicine is yet to make any real progress, and the plague is something which is mysterious. Of course, village people, as Basubidi mentioned, often depended upon these women for midwifery, with their own local knowledge of herbs and potions for minor ailments. And this is something which in Bengali we still use as a phrase called totka, which are handed over from generation to generation, not by our fathers, by the way, but by our mothers and our grandmothers, and which are practiced. But both of them are looked at with suspicion as witches. Additionally, you see, Anis is a freely sexual woman, which draws associations of prostitution. So cultural prejudices, you see, when the plague breaks out, these two women stand at the forefront of this cultural prejudice, and people look at them with a great deal of suspicion as having caused, great contagion. There's, of course, Josia Bont, and Frith is the maid who works with the vicar, as it were. And Josia Bont is a father who profits by digging graves and is brutally punished for attempting to bury a man alive. So you see, at a moment when the collective operates, it's not that everybody sort of participates. There are human beings and human corporations, as we find nowadays, which profit and in general thrive upon human suffering. Now, Anna Frith flees from the village with Elizabeth Bradford's illegitimate child and raises her in Onam. And this is interesting, really, because you see, what Brooks does is that Anna, after she's had had a sexual encounter with Montpellier, she flees with Elizabeth Bradford's illegitimate child to Algeria. And she decides to be the assistant to a Muslim doctor there, who gladly welcomes her because he cannot enter the harem and thereby administer the medicines to the women. So she becomes, as it were, the surrogate nurse and doctor, thereby fulfilling the vocation that she had shown in the district, in the village of Eymes. So the story is not in reality any longer the story about Montpellier and the people of Eymes. It becomes the story of Anna and the opportunity that the plague offers to her in order to grow. Now, this is the climactic sermon from which I have taken the title. This is delivered by William Mompesson, and in this novel by Montpellier, where he talks about let the boundaries of this village, here we are and here we must stay. The boundaries of this village become our whole world. Let none enter and none leave while this plague lasts. I once again remind you of the tremendous courage that must have been taken by the villagers to fight with a disease which caused so much suffering. Now, why do I use this prism of liminality? So this is where I sort of merge my understanding of the novel with my theoretical perspective. Liminal status in terms of narrative. Let me get back to this final point also, the genre. It becomes, it stands at that border between history and fiction. Eymes becomes the real topography from which the narrative or the fictional narrative takes off. And therefore, that is what Bakhtin points out, the historical novel's continual dialectic with both history and fiction, and thereby recovering histories which potentially would have been lost. Anna's history, for example. The collapse of the gentry. This is the point where you see the Restoration and the Enlightenment leads on to this movement from the gentry to the merchants. Therefore, the dying away of the gentry becomes that moment. From Anna, for example, this is this moment of the rite of passage, really, from the simple maid who is educated to a certain extent by Elinor to somebody who becomes a professional nurse and doctor. And very importantly also, and this the plague marked, is, and Bashabidi was talking about science, we heard a question on Tagore and cosmopolitanism, and Tagore would have said that science must belong to everybody, that if there's a vaccine, which that must be available to everybody. But the plague was the moment, we must remember, when towards the end of the 17th century, people were moving from the realization that the plague was not just God's affliction, but it was a natural contagion which had to have natural and human recourses. And it's very important. The final liminality is this status of the woman. You see, because while the people of Im believe in the older framework of categorizing the woman into either the witch or the prostitute or the simple maid, Anna, as it were, in her rite of passage, grows into newer roles and thereby fulfills, as it were, her vocation. So, as I point out, this is also a movement of Anna through the liminal state into a newer form of existence, and thereby create and thereby become a kind of touchstone for similar sort of liminal movements, similar rites of passage for women. Of course, I have talked about the abdication of the gentry, so I gradually move on through these liminal conditions. One, the abdication of the gentry, who are more concerned about their Miltons and their Drydens and packing them while they leave the village of Im. And Anna, of course, talks about the liminal zone between faith and science. Caught up within the struggle, Anna's dilemma mirrors that of the world of her time. She confesses, I cannot say I have faith anymore. Hope, perhaps. And this is something which Bashabidi talks about. It's very important to understand that Montpellier loses all hope, loses all faith. Yet Anna, she may lose her faith, but she does not lose her hope. And this is what Geraldine Brooks has to say about choosing Anna, the maid, as the narrator and the protagonist of the novel. She says, I wanted a narrator who was part of the ordinary life of the village, but also had access to the gentry, the decision makers. So you see, she's placed in that liminal zone between in terms of class. Since I knew that the real rector had a maid who survived the plague, she seemed the obvious choice. And then, Geraldine Brooks goes on to talk not merely about England, but also about the Middle East and Africa in her role as a reporter. And she talks about this, catastrophe where women are thrust into newer roles, right? Where women who are highly circumscribed and restricted are thrown into sudden turmoil and step out of their old roles and assume vastly challenging responsibilities. And become, say, for example, platoon leaders, or, for example, lead the children to safety, and thereby change and grow remarkably. Now, whether this will take place with the COVID-19 pandemic is something which sociology will tell us a little later on. But Brooks suggests that moments of these crises very often bring out the best in women and lead on to a profound change in their social identity. And this is something which I talked about when I talked about Bateman and the way in which women postponed marriage, participated in professions which were hitherto not available to them, and thereby, became more independent than they were earlier. So this is the great moment where the rite of passage for not only Anna, but also a lot of other women take place. Of course, Geraldine talks about the Restoration being a very fluid time, monarchy, church, institutions being challenged, and makes a very important point that, you see, treatise after treatise talks about, the fear of women stepping out of the fold and being loose charactered and so on. And she talks about the amount of hectoring from the pulpit. And she suggests that a lot of improper behavior, women were, of course, improper within quotes, stepping out into the public sphere, participating in public discourse, and experimenting with their own sexualities to a certain extent. So, you see, what Geraldine sees within that particular period where the plague is taking place is a profound shift in society. Now, let me come back to the duo of Mem Gori and Anis Gori. This is, of course, Anna, who's narrating this in a first person. And Anna, being extremely realistic as a widow, Anna is a widow. So she says, I wanted nothing of the herb knowledge. And she says how I knew how easy it is for a widow to be turned into witch in the common mind. And the first cause generally is that she meddles somehow in medicinals. So you see how gender is integrally woven into the concept of the female medical practitioner. You see, I'm reminded of Parashuram's story. You see, where this person who suffers from chronic disease, that he's a hypochondriac, and he actually sort of goes from doctor to doctor, and ultimately goes to a woman doctor, and the first question that he asks is, can a woman doctor actually cure me? And eventually marries the doctor. So while the story is extremely funny, there's also this very deep kind of misogyny which lurks within the story, that the woman as doctor can only cure by marrying the hypochondriac, as it were, and taking control over his life. Think about it deeply. But what I'm trying to sort of emphasize is how society in the early modern England would have frowned upon women as using medicines, as having power over life and death, as it were. So the way in which medicine was a highly gendered kind of discourse, and where the entry of the woman was prohibited or even frowned upon, is very evident in the way in which Mem Gori and Anis Gori are suspected by society, and how Anna sort of veers away from practicing the herbal medicines. But interestingly, what Geraldine Brooks also points out is this: despite this, there's this other, as you can say, other form of knowledge, as I pointed out, handed over from generation to generation through the Gori garden, and how ancient this tradition of the woman, medicine, and common sense are. And we do not even know the name of the wise woman who first laid out these beds, but the garden thrived here long before we came to tend it, and it will go on long after we depart. So Geraldine Brooks's novel is also looking at the ways in which alternative discourses thrive throughout history and are very often carried on by women. Now, Anis Gori, of course, is the rebel, the militant free woman, as it were, who talks about listening to her own heart than having her life ruled by other conventions, and therefore challenging these notions of dark and light, and Anis Gori confounded these things. So she's the one who exists on that liminal zone where she consciously tries to step out of the border of the zones that are defined for the woman, her body and her sexuality. And this is what Anis, in a moment when she's all sort of about to be thrown and hanged into the river as a witch, cries out to the people and says, yes, I have lain with him. I have lain with the devil. He's mighty and cold and ice to the touch. And this moment of death of Anis is a moment when the collective, as Geraldine Brooks points out, is the same collective which is capable of taking such a courageous decision when it comes to quarantining the village. and has such a great, warmth of heart, as a kind of breadth of vision, is also extremely constricted and uh, what we'll call extremely conservative when it comes to the castigating of the witch and punishing her in the most horrible way possible. In fact, uh, this entire novel shows how women also had to bear great cruelty from the collective when it came to disease. Uh, Anis, of course, talks about the female agency, and he says, she says, I'm no man's chattel. I have my work, which I love. I have my home, yet sufficient for my shelter. Right. And if you look at the last line, she says that sometimes a woman needs variety in sexuality. So why must I restrict myself to one man? Strikingly modern, strikingly postmodern, in fact, view of a female agency that is offered within the novel. So what Geraldine Brooks is also bringing out in the novel is the alternative discourses that were opening up for the women in 18th century England. And we remember, say, for example, Montagu, who actually brought back the system of inoculation for the smallpox from the Orient, and she was a woman. So zones which were opening up, women as writer, women taking part in different professions, demanding education, although it would take another century for it to be theorized in a very proper way, we can see that Geraldine is probing through a novel of disease into zones which were opening up for the women. Now, contrasted with Anis is Elinor, who also practices herbal potions, but she does it in an extremely docile way. So this is the woman who's trying to work through patriarchy. If Anis is the one who's throwing the towel in the face of patriarchy, as it were, Elinor is the one who sort of ushers in reason, ushers in education, ushers in a own way of sort of handling patriarchy, and sensitizes people to the fact that they should move away, especially the rural women, from superstition. Now, you see, therefore, what I'm trying to suggest is that for Brooks, this novel, The Year of Wonders, is actually one where society is taken over not by men but by women. Although Montpelier becomes the man who creates this, and it is recorded in history, William Montpesson transformed this village. What Brooks is trying to suggest is that within this time of the pandemic, it was the women who were offering potentials of growth and sustenance. And therefore, what Brooks does is he shows the failure of Montpelier, right? And Montpelier, despite marrying Elinor, has never had sex with her because she has had an abortion and her womb has been tarnished, and therefore he clings on, despite being such a wide-hearted man, despite being such a radical man in terms of quarantining the village. When it comes to sexuality of the woman, he quarantines her as well. So there are two quarantines operating here, one which is for the collective, and the other which on a personal level, the woman's body is seen essentially as corrupted by the pregnancy and therefore an abortion, and therefore must be quarantined from further sexual interaction. So the Montpelier, who is generous in terms of his identity as a priest, is equally conservative when it comes to his identity as a husband and as a man. And Brooks shows these contradictions. Also, you see, within the novel, the plague tests the people, and Montpelier fails the test when after Geraldine's death, Elinor's death, he loses all faith and has no qualms about sleeping with Anna. And Geraldine Brooks also points out that in an interview that the real priest, William Mompesson, had no qualms about sending out his own children whilst quarantining the entire village. So his own children were sent out of the village before he quarantined the entire village. So therefore, looks at the gray zones of body conduct and perceived myths in the times of a pandemic. This is, of course, Anna's movement from religious affliction to secular contagion. And she says that, it doesn't matter if, we are a village of sinners or a host of saints. The plague was spread and poisoned through our blood rather than, through God's affliction. You see, this is the moment when, taken together as a body, Anis Gori, Eleanor, and Anna arrive at this understanding and try and mitigate the sufferings of the people, not through religion, but through medicine. And that is when Anna recognizes that her vocation is to be a nurse and is to be a physician. And therefore, when she escapes, she does not any longer escape to another part of England where she realizes her scope is restricted. She moves to Algeria and Onam and arrives here and meets this Muslim doctor whose assistant she becomes. And the book she carries with her is the Eastern form of medicine, which is practiced by Avicenna. And she then talks about this way, this alternative way of medicine, where, and this is another part of the novel, where she talks about the importance of medicine not in curing, not as a curative, but also as a fortifier. So she's sort of bringing two paradigms of medicine together. One paradigm which talks about medicine as an antidote, and the other which talks about preventive medicine, boosting immunity. And she sees the two medicines, the Western paradigm as the antidote, which always looks at curing disease, and the Eastern medicine as preventing disease from within, right? And you see the way in which the doctor, the male doctor, also welcomes her presence, because through her he can then reach out to the women he has to cure within the veil. And this entire novel therefore becomes a story about Anna's maturity, and this becomes therefore for Anna the wonderful year, the year of wonder, where she moves from a simple peasant girl to a more complex, educated nurse and physician. And this is where this text becomes a text of her maturity. Now, I had sort of made a suggestion that I would like to weave in some of Geraldine Brooks's other texts. And the text that I'd like to talk about is 9 Paths of Desire, where Geraldine Brooks, in fact, was one of the first to talk about a concept of Islamic feminism. And the title of this text is taken from the text which talks in Arabic about the woman, that God having given men and women 10 parts of desire, and women have 9 parts, and men have been given only 1 part. So you see, there is also a history of not only in fact the culture in the Muslim lands, but also equally in Hindu and Christian lands, where the female body is seen as a site of sexuality, that women are motivated. We remember Pope's misogynistic comment, most women have no character at all. So, Geraldine Brooks sets off as a Pulitzer-winning journalist, and this is the one book which won her an award, in exploring the condition of Muslim women in the vast part of the Orient, of the Islamic world. And she talked about the ways in which female genital mutilation takes place. And she talks about the ways in which the hijab is used in these societies. And she also talks about the ways in which Muslim women despite being, sort of prohibited by the hijab, as it were, have devised their own ways of finding out their own agencies and reacting to it. Now, of course, this novel was this text was widely criticized. Especially, I bring to you a criticism from the Griffith Review, which argued that Geraldine Brooks was falling into the trap of the Oriental, and that her perpetuality of Islam is essentially misogynistic, and that this very concept that she could know the heterogeneous body of Islamic women through one particular book, and by moving across one particular area, was extremely presumptuous. I'm not going to go into that. What I'm trying to talk about here is, why does Geraldine Brooks write about the plague in 2001? I think, and this is what she has also articulated, that she takes the plague as that moment when the woman is thrown into a crisis. And being thrown into a crisis, she sees the moment as the one where modernity has an incursion upon an older worldview. And in that incursion, the woman essentially transforms herself. I link this novel, and that is why I would suggest that Geraldine Brooks ultimately locates Anna not in a Western society, but in Algeria, where she suggests that a woman like Anna would have a new opportunity. And in doing so, she links her book, Year of Wonders, to her other book, 9 Parts of Desire. In this particular era of Islamic feminism, and this is a phrase that she keeps on using, where the woman, despite being constrained, and she's talking about the Islamic women here, despite being constrained by a hugely misogynist male society, is finding her own ways of adjustment, her own ways of empowerment, and her own ways of reclaiming her own body. You see, at the end of the novel, Anna, of course, has 2 children by her side. The child whom she has taken from Elizabeth Bradford and has nursed and brought up, a name she has given Aisha, and the other child whom she has had with this brief sexual encounter with Montpellier, whom she has named after her mentor, Elinor. You see, I look at this novel as one which, in the moment, which through a discourse of disease, talks about the potential of the female protagonist and characters as adjusting to it, the catastrophe, and emerging stronger out of it. So my conclusions there: plague created hazards as well as opportunities for women, but specifically during the plague, the urban women were placed in a double bind. This was a historical part which I sort of gleaned from multiple sources. In the absence of any significant records, it's difficult to exactly predict the trauma and the tribulation of the women during this period. They remain largely neglected voices. And it is this gap, I suggest, that historical fiction seeks to probe, articulating liminal zones where the conflicts between traditional ideas and new opportunities for women could be discerned. And in linking the history of the plague, the Year of Wonders, as it were, with the 9 Parts of Desire in another distant location, Geraldine Brooks talks about the way in which women's bodies, minds, personalities have resisted and triumphed over disease and pandemics, and thereby creating a new voice of hope. And this voice of hope, this voice of growth, this voice of adjustment, this voice of, as it were, evolution, is what links my discussion with the message of hope that Bashabidi had just delivered a few moments ago. Thank you for listening patiently to me, and I would welcome your suggestions and comments. Thank you.
I'm a bit overwhelmed, Amrit, because you had very modestly said that you were taking a narrower view, and I think you have totally flouted your own premise, because you bring in so much, very rich discussion. I'm definitely going to go away like everybody else and read more of Geraldine Brooks. What you have done is just a wonderful journey where you have brought in a prism that we really need to use now, the liminal zone, that gray area which offers a gateway, as it were, from an old world to a new world. And you have shown it through the body of the women. It was a very eloquent study, very compelling, that you have shown us how the variations of agency, the role of women have become the acts of resistance to patriarchy, to perceived beliefs, and leading to a subversion of the then accepted normal. And how in times of crisis like the plague, a woman becomes the nurturer, the one who moves from the private to the public space, the carer, but also the one with knowledge. And that is something you have shown through the role of Anna, and also the other women who take on themselves, like I was just looking at the various, like Mem Gaudi and Anis Gaudi, and also Eleanor and Elizabeth as well. I think what, for me, I find really fascinating about your study is how you have taken away the glorification of Montpellier through history, that he was the man who took the stand, that wonderful, courageous stand that they would lock themselves in and lock the world out. And yet he sent his children away. So I'm really glad you brought that in, his double standards, which actually mirror society, patriarchy, and how these double standards are waived by the women, who actually put their bodies at risk as they take on the role of nurturer and nurse. I also am really, I was really struck by the image of the red wand that you spoke about. It's almost like a red flag, and that prostitutes carried white wands. And this is something that I always find really interesting, that women have to wear badges always, and I remember my parents' friend telling me how she decided that she would wear a ring because her husband could wear a ring, and that is why she didn't wear shidur, because he didn't. So it's quite interesting that we always have these badges of identification that society imposes on women, and this is something that Anna is able to escape when she, as you show, when she leaves England and then travels to Algeria. And I'm really glad you see this post-colonial perspective and bring in Arab medicine, because it's only post-colonialists who can show the Arab not as demonic, but as healers. And this is something that Ondaatje shows in The English Patient, where the English patient is left as dead, having been burnt into a faceless non-identity, and it's Arab travelers who pick him up and give him some sort of identity back again in a restored face. So I think this, what you've done in this post-colonial novel, is shown how through your analysis, a very strong analysis, probing, reflective, and an act of recovery on your part as a post-colonialist yourself. And I think this liminal space that you explore is really interesting, as the woman leaves her private sphere and enters the public sphere, not to subvert the stifling standards of a hypocritical society, where she shows up a community that can no longer continue as they have been. So the woman, in showing that she is capable of assuming a responsible and public role, as in the economic sphere as well, is almost like the women who took up jobs during the war in Europe, and the women during partition and after partition, who became the breadwinners. So in times of crisis, as you have shown through Anna, your study of Anna, women actually subvert assumptions of women's role as minimal to social economic development. So I think that's wonderful. I loved your pointing to the bill of mortality, the role that they played as searchers will stay with me, searchers and keepers. Finally, I think what you have shown is Geraldine Brooks has shown through her novel, as you have pointed out, that women actually need to come forward to break down the walls created by patriarchy in times of crisis, in their roles as nurturers who are unafraid and who show extreme courage, and, as you noted, and leave a sense of hope, as literature like this does. Thank you, Amrit. That was brilliant. And can we open it up to questions now and comments?
Ma'am, with your permission, sir, with your permission, am I audible, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Am
absolutely.
I audible? Yeah. Sir, could we have a few questions? Would you like to take them up?
Sure, sure.
Okay, so this is Tela Bishwas. Sir, what would be your opinion on the fluidity of the present pandemic situation, when the lockdown has restricted spatial movement for everyone and women have to almost multitask from home itself? This is Tela Biswas.
Right. First of all, thank you, Bashobidi, for those very kind words and the way in which you really summed up the points that I was trying to make. Thank you also for pointing out there's something which I will linger on for a moment before I go to the question. How the World War actually created a similar opportunity. And yes, partition. I was reminded of a paper which we did once, on Mohanagar, and Meghedaka Tara, the two films, which sort of present these two perspectives, Nipa sort of crying out, Ami bachte cheyechilam, I wanted to live too. And in Mohanagar, where, Madhavi's character actually sort of steps out, and the partition gives her the opportunity of interacting with the public sphere and thereby creating. So thank you very much. I think, that somewhere within my more written form of this paper, that suggestion will, of course, find a very important space. Okay. Now, the question of fluidity, and I see also there's this question of domestic violence somewhere coming in. So I'll take that from the comments, with your permission. You see, yes, true. I think many people have pointed out, and sociologists also, that, what the lockdown has what the lockdown has also meant is also women being forced into a lot more work than otherwise. And then also, you see, again, as Bashubidhi pointed out, the hypocrisy that men can get away with, closing the doors and working from home, whilst women have to, also cook and do the dishes. But I think the lockdown has also alerted men to the fact, that the domestic space is not something which can be forgotten and wished away at the back of their minds. So we have also, if there has been an increase of domestic violence on the one hand, then there's also been a degree of participation by men as well in the household chores, as it were. So this divide between the public and the private, between the home and the world, as it were, has been challenged by the pandemic to a large extent. Now, of course, you see, we are not going to look at the effects of this on a very short-term basis. You see, what we are looking at in the violence is probably the way in which patriarchy will respond to men to this crisis. But I think, once this concept of the work from home actually deepens, and this is going to be one of the fallouts of this, once this concept of the work from home deepens, I think, and I hope, hope is the word which I use, a more equitable distribution of work between the man and the woman. I think a lot of jokes have been going around, which, unfortunate as they are, but which are alerting us to the fact that, this binary of the man as the breadwinner and the woman as the domestic nurturer is undergoing a certain strain. I think that is probably one of the positives which is bound to come out of this issue, right? So those are two questions which I took together.
Very good.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Unmute.
Indri, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, right. I can't hear you.
Indri is still not audible.
No.
Can we go on to the next question? Maybe she can figure out.
Yes. Am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible now.
Okay. So the next question is, this is Debanjan Mitra. How can we see the struggles of faith and science, medicine and meat in curing, altering the existing social hierarchical structures?
Well, that is a very profound question, really. But, I would respond it in this way, that the COVID-19 has shown us a new face of medicine, you see, where in the absence of a vaccine or a particular drug, the only way has been once again to go back to our roots and ask questions as to how we can prevent. I will go back to this old adage that prevention is better than cure. So we are looking at systems of medicine, really, where we are building up or fortifying ourselves, as Anna would sort of talk about this at the end of Geraldine Brooks's novels. So in a certain way, it links up also with the hierarchical structures in society. You see, one is that we are recognizing that, for example, in terms of hierarchy, the power of the nurse over the power of the doctor. You see, in the traditional hierarchy of medicine, it is always the doctor who gets he is the one who is projected. We now realize how important the health worker is. And the health worker as a category is much wider, as it were, right? So in that sense, the power structure has been challenged. The second thing which I have to really understand is, as Bashubidi pointed out, and this is something which has also been pointed out. You see, what is the one thing that we are lacking now? Air. The thing which we cannot really buy, the thing which is free to all, right? So, in the way in which the disease has cut across categories, is something which has forced, in a certain way, to understand, you see, that until and unless we invest, and here I agree completely with Bashubidi, that until and unless we engage and invest in the broader and wider cross-section of people, that the balcony babus and maims will not be safer. We will be safe if the entire society is safe. We will be exposed, unsafe, and vulnerable if, the broader body of people are diseased. So I'm looking forward to it. If I don't know whether this will happen or not, but in countries like India, I think what has been woefully exposed is the unpreparedness and lack of investment in public health. This is a category which we have actually completely, along with health, education is going to be the other, I hope, beneficiary of this. That when we host such a webinar where Bashubidi, I, and you can take part, there's a vast body of people, your students included, my students included, especially mine, because they are, part of a slightly more remote and rural area. Access and equality, I think, have to be brought together. And that is where you see hierarchies have to be rethought. If we miss this opportunity, then I think we will have committed a grave crime. And I use that word with all its implications.
Sneha, do we have any more questions?
Yes, Partho Devnath has a question. He says, the searching still remains with the women, that is, the Anganwadi workers or the women working in the health centers. Do you think the shadows of the past remain in our thinking process regarding women?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You see, the way in which very often, for a very small amount of money, women are forced into these professions, and in the way in which their role has continually been marginalized, is something that is a legacy of the past that we have still inherited, and it remains ingrained or embedded in our societies. We have to take a very careful look at it. As Bashubidi pointed out, you see, when we talk about a Jan Dhan, really, and money reaching the people, it's not just 1,000 rupees given to a person, and you say, and you sort of brandish this: I've given 10,000, I've given 1,000 rupees to an account. But in the way in which it has actually reached the empowered hands. And I think this is very important to understand who are the people who are fighting for us. And in the fighting for us, on television, you always have X doctor or Y doctor. But the workers who map the plague, and the workers who, even for that matter, clean the streets for you, are as important to this battle and to our public concept of health as the others. In fact, I would like to talk about, for a brief moment, allow me to talk about Rabindranath once again. You see, once when Rabindranath was talking about public health, and he sort of, Elmhurst came, and you see, along with Elmhurst, we have forgotten the role of a woman whom I've written about in the book that we edited, Gresham Green, a nurse who came from, America. And she was the one who at Binuria sort of created small models where, midwifery was taught, where women's contribution to public health was recognized. You have this concept, for example, if you talked about Anganwadi workers, take a thought about how majority of children are sort of delivered in India through the Daima, right? So Rabindranath was one of the first to think about how these women had to be trained and how they had to be empowered so that they in turn could provide a better, service to society and be recognized as such. I think this recognition is very important.
Very good.
So,
So would you
there
take one
is-
more question? I think
Yeah, sure.
Related
Yes,
to
yes.
beverages.
The questions are yeah.
Exactly, sir. Yeah.
Questions are the most important part of any discussion. So I would take not one, but many, if time permits.
Thank you so much, sir. So this is from Shantanu Maji. Do you think, contrary to Anna's crossing the threshold, the fact that she must keep the hope high till the end reinstates the patriarchal desire of women to act as preserver and caregiver?
Look, you see, what is, and Shantanu has a point there, that, despite being empowered in a certain way, Anna is still playing second fiddle to the doctor, even in Onam. And that there's an episode in the novel, for example, I would like to share this with you, Shantanu, because you've raised this question, where in the room of the doctor, she finds actually a book in Arabic, which she takes to her own room and tries reading. And this is the actual manual of medicine. And the doctor, when he comes back, is extremely angry that Anna has taken the book from him. So, dispensing medicine and cure is still a male prerogative, as it were, even in Arab society and in the society that Anna tries to, I wouldn't say infiltrate, but Anna tries to enter. Having said that, Shantanu, I would also suggest that, you see, what Geraldine Brooks is bringing to us is also a slice of history. We cannot, sort of take this away. That hers is a time when, a small breakthrough in our terms would be a large breakthrough on her terms. You see, you have to put this in perspective. So in that sense, Anna's wonderful year or year of wonder is really a year of wonder in this ability to make this transition. However, you see, I keep on saying this, that, there is still this gap between the way in which women enter the medical profession and are restricted to certain branches of specialization than men doctors usually do. So, no, I don't think Geraldine Brooks is reiterating that binary. She's pointing out to a possibility. But in 9 Parts of Desire, that is a non-fictional book which you read, will give you this uneasiness that you have here, and you are articulating an uneasiness as to whether this is really radical or whether this is really conservative. So that, I would say, you see, Geraldine Brooks being located as she is in Australia, and she's writing with a certain loadedness in her position, will always face this kind of this uneasiness. But when it comes to representation of Anna, I would say that it is far more radical than really, reiterating a masculinist position or a patriarchal position. Sorry.
Can we take one more question?
Sure.
Okay, Anuradha Mojumdar, she's asking, in this pandemic, women doctors, nurses, who no longer occupy liminal spaces educationally and professionally, are putting themselves to risk. Would it redefine heroism in future literary works?
Absolutely. I think, we are looking at, and as gradually the profession is changing, the entry of doctors, nurses, in many ways. But I've also made this point, the way in which, the COVID-19 situation has made us realize the importance of nursing. Earlier, in our earlier discourses, it's more the doctor. The nurse is always seen as this glorified, person, but who really has no agency. But having said that, once again, you see, Anuradha, may I ask you, how many women doctors have you seen on television? You see, this is something which I find very, very problematic in a certain way. You see, in the way in which, doctors, when they're projected on the public media, are very often male doctors. You see, we have really very little idea about the problems that women doctors are facing. Right. And I think the media needs to be far more responsible and more alert in the way in which these doctors are being forced to wear PPEs for 12 hours. You see, not using the washroom during that interval, and then coming back and also, nurturing and taking part in the affairs of the home, as it were, educating the child, as it were. So the tribulations and problems that are faced by women doctors, I don't think has adequately been represented. And I think the heroism that they are showing needs to be not only recognized, but also celebrated. They are the real heroes, as it were.
Okay, here is a very interesting question. Spondon Ghosh is asking, role of women here is supreme and science is environment oriented. Do you think this can be seen as a critique of urbanity, a discourse that was dealt in Satyajit Ray's Aguntuk?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in the way that Geraldine Brooks has shifted this entire discourse away from the city and put it across into the village of Eam. You see, once again, in the absence, and this is something which we haven't really thought through, all our discourses, and if you look at the media discourses also, have been, the lack of adequate beds in cities like Calcutta and Ahmedabad and Mumbai. What and how is rural India coping with the pandemic? We have had very little discussion about this. So yes, in a certain way, this is also, and you see, it's very interesting in the way, in the absence of adequate medicines, health centers, you have COVID hospitals almost everywhere. But, believe me, I once took my students out for an excursion and one of them fell ill. And I had to sort of try and give her oxygen somewhere. Super specialty hospitals which are spread now all across the state, my state at least. But when I went there, I saw buildings and beds, but no doctors and no equipment. So how is rural India coping? And in a certain way, the way in which Mem Gori and Anis Gori were coping, they're still probably based on traditional herbal medicines, Ayurveda, homeopathy, is something which, in the sheer absence of ventilators and even basic things like oxygen cylinders, the fight of urban centers is very different from the fight of the rural centers. And yes, it is in a large way a critique of urbanity that Geraldine Brooks is engaged in. And I think as time goes on, we'll find more such representative works coming through.
Okay, there's a question from Professor Shubhajit Sengupta from Burdwan University. He's asking, do you think that the use of the first-person narrator in a novel carry the assurance that the narrator will live till the end to tell the story in spite of the plague?
Well, yes. I think so, yes. The very fact that he's there to write a narrative marks that she is a survivor, right? And therefore that, in a certain sense, you see, the first person narrative not only gives an authenticity, but also a sense of authority. Anna's position is very interesting. Anna is placed in the house where the plague actually breaks out. The story is that a tailor from London actually bought a packet of cloth which was infected, and this was the source of the plague. So Anna's house is the house where the plague breaks out, Her husband is already dead. He was a miner who worked in a mine, as it were. And 2 of her children perish during the plague. So, as it were, she's a free agent who has suffered through the plague, yet who has survived the plague. And therefore, her voice carries a degree of not only, agency in terms of education or, involvement and nurturing, but also an agency in terms of survival. I think that is a very important point that Shubhajit has made. Thank you, Shubhajit, for that question.
Are there any more questions or comments?
There's one more question that can be addressed to both of you, has been addressed to both of you actually. So if I may, this is from Manvi Sharma, NIT Uttarakhand. In a post-COVID world, can ecofeminism be used to awaken consciousness and sensitize the world for sustainable development?
I think Amrit should take that first.
Well, of course, this is it's not just a question; it's the need of the hour, really. As Bashubhidi points out, the emergence of the Anthropocene has been, hugely patriarchal in the way in which we have seen consumption, and especially, almost it's been a kind of a plunder, as it were. The body of the environment has it were been ravaged really by a capitalist network of people who have seen that nature is just a system of resources to be used. So yes, a simultaneous awareness of the way in which feminism and ecology and the eco-criticism have worked is crucially necessary for us to find out ways. And as Bashubhidi pointed out, the Prime Minister of England, New Zealand, for example, and the Prime Minister of Canada, for example, have shown us the ways in which, discourses on gender need to be put at the forefront. And is it very, very surprising that, people like Angela Merkel and the Prime Minister of England, Jacqueline, I forget her name, have been at the forefront of societies which have tackled the pandemic far more, let us say, competently than many alpha male prime ministers. I'm sorry if that sounds a little obnoxious, but that's the truth. Bashubhidi, what would be your response?
Well, I completely agree with you, Amrit, and you put it very well. And the alpha males are obnoxious, so we needn't be apologetic about that, especially the leaders. And I mentioned Brazil earlier, and you are so right that women who lead countries today, in fact, there's been a study to show that 8 countries led by women have tackled the coronavirus and had the fewest deaths in their countries. So I think, yes, ecofeminism has to take a lead right now. And as Amrit's whole paper shows, women are nurturers, are nourishers, are carers, and they're caring, and they have human empathy. And they are the ones, like Anna, who give us hope. So I think it's time we moved on. Just one more point, and that is, if we look at India and other countries, women have been the ones who fetch water for their families. They walk miles to get water. And of course, little children, because little children are the ones who will listen to the mother and not the father. So so women have this role of actually sustaining us. They're the ones who have been the fuel gatherers, who lit the fires for nourishment, not the fires to destroy woods, as in Brazil, but fires to nourish us, the domestic fires. So I think women's roles are always important. I just want to add one more thing to what Amrit pointed out as well about the women nurses and doctors being at the forefront. The woman leading the scientific research in Imperial College in Oxford, who are working together now. The scientist is a woman. The public health director in Edinburgh University right now is not just a woman, but of Indian descent, right? So they are on TV, which is like a breath of fresh air now. So that's one thing. The other is roles have been reversed ever since men started becoming nurses. So, just as women have entered medicine as doctors, and I also, something that you all know, that the first woman doctor in Britain, in spite of Anna, who was a healer and had to go to the East to find recognition and a role for herself, in the novel, which Amrit so beautifully analyzed, the first woman doctor in Britain was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who actually had to impersonate as a man to pass medicine. And once she cleared her exams and stood before her examiners, she told them that, women can be doctors, and I have just proved it. Because they said no woman could ever become a doctor. She didn't have the brain to do it. So I think, yes, it's time women came forward in a big way through literature, through ecofeminism.
Do you have a time for one small question? Amrita?
Go ahead. How can I say no to you?
Amrit is happy.
Okay. So actually, I was wondering, after reading Anna Frith, the kind of resilience that Anna Frith shows somewhat reminds us of Thomas Hardy's heroines. So how would you place Anna Frith's character vis-a-vis Hardy's women characters, like Jude Foley or Sue Brydet?
Are you? I have a little difficulty, Shubham, with that question, because you see, the endurance that you are talking about in Hardy's women characters are not exactly in the way in which Anna shows her endurance. You see, in a certain sense, Anna is different because she does not accept, and she breaks new ground. So in that sense, even though Hardy's women were caught in a space of transition, in a space of historical transition, I would say, given the sheer amount of space that Anna travels, and when I mean space, I'm talking about social space, I'm talking about educational space as well as geographical space, I would find Anna much more enduring and radical than Hardy's protagonists. Right.
Okay.
Are there any more questions or comments? Can I wind up there?
No, I don't think so.
And then leave it to Shubham to actually close it. Sorry? No more questions. Yeah. Before I pass it on to Shubham for his concluding remarks, can I just can you all join me once again to thank Amrit for a very probing, thought-provoking, radical analysis of a woman's role in a novel which goes back as far as 1666. I wanted to add, Amrit, next time, while I was listening to you, and if I ever have a chance again to talk about this with you, I was also thinking of Simon Armitage's poem on lockdown, called Lockdown, which actually speaks about the village aim. But what is refreshing is, while we are here in Gokhale in India, he brings in India as well in his poem, where he says, now that we cannot, in EM, where and now where we can't talk to lovers separated because of the lockdown, we can rely on Kalidash's Meghdut to take our messages of love. It's actually going back to nature again, but India is brought in a most beautiful way in Simon Armitage's Lockdown. And can I say that, Amrit, you have made me rethink a lot of things, and one of them always bothers me, and that is the lack of investment in health that this pandemic has shown up in every country. India spends 1% of her GDP on health. How can India be prepared? India is the second largest buyer of weapons after Saudi Arabia. Should we not divert the money to healthcare and shelter and sanitation and education and clean water? In Britain, for 10 years, this government has eroded the National Health Service and was totally unprepared. We didn't have enough beds, we didn't have enough nurses, and we definitely didn't have PPE. In America, the nurses and carers and doctors had to wear bin bags to prepare to look after their patients. They didn't have PPE, enough PPE. But America's military and police are clothed to the hilt. They have wonderful uniforms right down to their boots. Well, their doctors didn't have masks and gloves and other PPE equipment. So my question is, as Amrit has said, could we rely on literature, Amrit, for instilling hope, for re-educating us, for making us rethink, as Anna's role makes us rethink things? Could we do that, as Geraldine Brooks has suggested? So thank you, and can you finish off with one little line to give us hope? Amrit.
I think, Bashopati, once again, I'll go back to Rabindranath.
Okay, thank you.
You see, when he talks about the Mukto Vayu that we need, and he talks about the Ayu and the ball, here is the premier poet of the world actually going back to the basic things of health and agriculture, going back in Sriniketan. And I think that is the model which we need to think about. You see, that where literature is concerned and poets are concerned, they are the sentries. The way in which Shelley talks about the mind as a fading coal and the poets as the legislators of the world. I think that should be our message of hope, that somewhere among the vast body of people who are listening in and who are thinking about this, we will create opinions that will percolate and force policymakers to think on this issue. Right? And thank you once again, for alerting us in your presentation as to if we take nature for granted, there might be a time when nature will survive, but we won't be able to, despite our weapons and our technologies. Thank you, Bashopati.
Thank you, Amrit. So, shall I draw this session to a close and thank Amrit again for a perceptive, brilliant paper which is going to stay with us, and I hand it over to Gokhale, to Shubham, to all of you who have stayed with us, to conclude.
Sincerest thanks to all the speakers, our principal ma'am, for giving us the scope, for giving us the scope to listen to you for 2.5 hours right now. And thank you, and we look forward to having you with us in the future again, if we organize such webinar again in the coming years, in the coming days. And to all the listeners who have listened so patiently over the 2.5 hours, I'd like to say a few words for them. The feedback form that you are looking for will be in the comment box on the third day. And from tomorrow onwards, we will show two WhatsApp numbers on the screen to which you can send your questions, not leaving them apart on the YouTube comment box. And tomorrow, we will begin from 3 o'clock onwards. We will have three very interesting speakers, Dr. Ananya Ghoshal, Dr. Minu Suzan Kozi, and Monikornika Dotto. And with this, we would like to call it a day for today. Again, thanking all the speakers and StreamYard for giving us this opportunity for this uninhibited YouTube streaming. Thank you all, and hope to meet you again in the future. And stay safe in the troubled times.
Thank you, Shubham. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How do I?